not something that people are going to outgrow. It's a progressive disease, and it will actually get worse if it's not treated. And so the earlier we can treat this, the better. This is a disorder. It is a problem that is affecting our children. This is not just the adults. A few years ago, I was featured in an article in People magazine that was called the Cyber Porn Generation. And the thing that got us into that article was a client we had, whose story, through somehow had gotten to their attention. I have yet to figure out how, because it certainly didn't come to our center. But this particular lady had come to us for treatment, and she presented to us as a pretty typical female sex addict. But there was only one difference. She was only 9 years old. And what had happened was she had found her dad's internet pornography. Rather than telling her mother, she got hooked on it for 9 months. Her brothers caught her. They went to mom, and that's how dad's problem was exposed. Now, since that time, we have treated a 12-year-old girl who was exposed to an accidental pop-up ad while doing her homework for school. She was hooked for 11 months before her mother found out about it. We have had a 5-year-old boy charge about $800 worth of pornography on a family credit card. Had a 7-year-old charge about $600 worth of pornography on a family credit card. And so we have seen a number of children getting involved with this at earlier and earlier ages. And we'll look at some statistics on that a little bit later. One thing we have to remember when it comes to the internet is that our children are much more at home and much more comfortable with these machines than we are. You and I all had to learn these things. Our kids, on the other hand, they're growing up with them. And were it not for my daughter, I would not have a computer running in PowerPoint tonight. She's been helping me with PowerPoint since she was 10 years old. She's 16. And, I just pray every time I touch these machines that they don't blow up. But they've grown up with these things, and so they're used to them, and as a result they're more comfortable, so they can access the good side of the internet, but there is a dark side as well. A wise man once said, "There is nothing new under the sun." Now, a lot of folks think that the internet has been really the onset or the start of this problem, when in reality it's been here for a long, long time. If I call this man's name, Dr. Benjamin Rush, do any of you know who he is? Okay. If you were to look at the American Psychiatric Association's logo, it's actually his likeness that's there. As a note of trivia, he is also one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Dr. Benjamin Rush. He lived in the late early 1800s and was very prominent in the medical field in his day. And he published a textbook in 1812 that was called Medical Inquiries and Diseases of the Mind. And in that book, there is a chapter that is called Morbid States of the Sexual Appetite, and it is case studies and descriptions of what today we would call sex addicts. And so there is nothing new about this problem. This has been around for a long time, and what it is in this book, it's just references to out-of-control sexual behavior. Now, I'm told if you are rolling in dough that you can buy a copy of that book on the internet somewhere for around $1,200. Someone told me that parts of it have been uploaded. It's probably out there somewhere today. People like Kraft Evans, John Money, and others wrote extensively about hypersexuality throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. One of the things that we find as we're dealing with this problem, as I said, it's not new, but sexual addiction, and it is really a bad term. It's really more appropriately called an intimacy disorder. Because if it was about sex, then the answer to this whole thing would be simple. We just have male sex addicts marry female sex addicts, they could go at it all day and everyone would be happy. But we've seen those marriages, and that's not what happens. And so that's because it's not about sex. It's ultimately about intimacy and that longing for connection, that longing for a bond with another human being. Sex addiction is a multi-dimensional problem. And as you're thinking about how you work with people who will come to you who are struggling with this, it's very important to remember this model. Probably the biggest mistake I see made in treatment when it comes to the churches that are addressing this issue is they only address one dimension of the problem. Perhaps they'll try to treat it as strictly a spiritual problem. Okay, let's pray, let's read the Bible, let's get good at spiritual disciplines, and that's going to make this go away. Well, the spiritual disciplines can be a great tool in terms of the recovery journey and the transformation process. But there are other issues that have to be addressed as well. Historically, certain groups will only deal with it from a behavioral aspect. Anything you have to do to not act out or to stop the behavior. Well, that's great. Bottom line is you've got to stop the behavior if you're going to get well, if you're going to get sober. But what we find happens is if people only deal with one or two of those dimensions, it's about like taking your kids to Chuck E. Cheese and playing that game whack-a-mole. Every time you beat one or two down, there's 5 more popping up to get you from another side. And you're trying to hold these down while you constantly beat the others down. And that's what happens when we only treat one or two dimensions. So it's very important that we look at the spiritual, emotional dimensions. Yeah, there are traumas, there are wounds that have to be addressed, that are screaming out, which is what people are acting out for, is they're medicating something. And in treatment, we're trying to look at what are they medicating. There are physical dimensions. A lot of times there are comorbid or co-occurring disorders, things like depression or ADHD. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a big one. The behavioral dimension, stopping the behaviors and replacing them with new ones. And then a relational dimension. This impacts family relationships. It's going to impact marriages, and it will impact the way people relate to and connect with other people. For some of these sex addicts, their relationships throughout their lives have been sexualized. And so getting them to a part of the group process is getting them to learn to relate to others in a non-sexual way. Very important to remember that we're going to have to hit more than one dimension. And as we get towards the end of this tonight, what I want to do is go through each of these 5 dimensions and try to apply it to your all situation as best we can. Well, one of the questions that comes up is, how do you define this problem? What is sexual addiction? And one of the definitions I've given here is a classic one that comes from Dr. Patrick Carnes. He's kind of been the grandfather of the modern day treatment movement for this. And he says to be addicted is to have a pathological or an unhealthy relationship with a mood-altering substance or behavior. And I like his emphasis on behavior because behavior will alter the mood as well. It's not just injecting a substance that will alter your behavior or your mind. John Seeley has a definition. He says it's a pathological relationship with a mood-altering experience, which is associated with the denial of adverse consequences and the loss of control. And as we're familiar with alcoholics, most alcoholics, when they're sober, could tell you, yeah, I know better. I know this is going to destroy my liver. I know all of these things could happen to me, but knowing better does not stop them from doing it. And in the same way, someone dealing with sexual addiction issues, they will also be continuing those behaviors in spite of the fact that they may, quote, know better. Well, one of the questions you'll have to deal with in Christian settings is this one. Is this addiction or is this sin? We hear this one all the time. And there's a pretty simple answer to this question. The answer is yes, it's both. Are all people who are sexually addicted going to be involved in sexual sin? And the answer is yes. Are all people who are involved in sexual sin going to be sex addicts? And the answer is no. They won't all be addicted. There can be other issues that lead people to pornography use or to other forms of sexual acting out that are not necessarily addictive, though we'll focus more on the addiction in our discussion tonight. Now, these statistics I have found fascinating. One of the things over the years I have noticed in working in particular with Christians who struggle with sexual addiction is I've noticed that the values